What if I told you that the bank your money sits in right now was born in a coffee house? That the global financial system, the modern orchestra, the vaccine that saved your life, none of them would exist without an empire most history books dismiss in a single paragraph? And here's what's stranger still. The people who built that empire never intended to reshape the West. They were simply surviving. This is the story of 5 invisible threads, 5 moments where the Ottoman Empire quietly rewrote the source code of the modern world. And once you see them, you cannot unsee them. We like to treat history as a collection of isolated events, dusty moments locked behind museum glass, with no connection to the phone in your hand or the city outside your window. But that's not how history works. History is a chain reaction. Pull one thread, and the entire fabric shifts. Think about this. A cannon fires at the walls of Istanbul in 1453. Within decades, a sailor named Columbus is standing on the shores of an unknown continent. Are those 2 events connected? You're about to find out. Or this. A British ambassador's wife witnesses something disturbing in an Istanbul courtyard in 1717. Within a generation, that scene saves hundreds of thousands of lives across Europe. Coincidence? Not even close. The Ottoman Empire was not just a military power or a trade hub or a religious state. It was a pressure system, and every empire that felt that pressure had to transform or collapse. In this video, we follow the evidence, not myths, not national narratives, just the data, and what it reveals about how the world we live in today was actually built. Let's start with something deceptively simple: a trade route. Every school textbook tells the same story about the age of discovery. Brave captains, distant horizons, the thrill of the unknown. But strip away the romance, and a very different picture emerges. In 1453, the Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople and locked its grip over the ancient silk and spice roads. For Europe, this wasn't just a political shock. It was an economic catastrophe. The Mediterranean, once a free highway of trade, was now an Ottoman lake, and every ship that passed through it paid Ottoman tolls. Cities like Venice and Genoa had built their entire civilizations on those routes. Now those lifelines were choked. Inflation surged. Spices vanished from shelves. Silk became a luxury only kings could afford. The question was no longer, what's beyond the horizon? The question became, how do we survive? Here's where it gets interesting. To manage this new flow of trade, the Ottomans didn't just build walls. They built legal systems. They created the capitulations, formal agreements that gave foreign merchants specific rights to operate inside the empire. Later generations would call these agreements signs of weakness, but at the time they were something remarkable. Early templates for modern free trade law. European merchants had never seen anything like it, and to keep up, European states had to create commercial courts, standardized contracts, and maritime legal codes to settle disputes between Eastern and Western traders. The legal architecture of global commerce was being born, not in London or Paris, but in the chaos of Ottoman customs houses. And the ocean? The wide open Atlantic Ocean? It stopped being a mystery and became a strategy. Columbus wasn't chasing wonder, he was chasing a workaround. Da Gama wasn't seeking glory, he was seeking a bypass. The Age of Discovery, one of the most transformative eras in human history, was at its core a response to Ottoman economic pressure. But trade routes and legal codes weren't the only thing being reshaped. Because the same empire that controlled the flow of goods also possessed a technology that would shake the very foundations of European power. One wall at a time. For 1,000 years, European nobles ruled from behind thick stone walls. The castle wasn't just a home, it was a statement. It said, "You cannot touch me." On May 29, 1453, that statement was proven wrong. The Ottoman siege cannons, known as the Shahi, were unlike anything Europe had ever faced. These weren't ordinary weapons. They were engineering marvels that pushed the limits of 15th century metallurgy, and they turned impenetrable fortresses into rubble in days. But here's what most people miss. When those walls fell, it wasn't just a city that collapsed. It was an entire political model. For centuries, European feudalism had rested on one simple truth. A local lord with a castle was untouchable by his king. Private sovereignty hidden behind stone and mortar. Ottoman artillery erased that truth. Suddenly, every European monarch faced a terrifying question. If my nobles can't hide behind their walls, neither can I. The answer? Centralize everything. European rulers began building state-controlled artillery corps. That required money, which required taxes. Taxes required bureaucracies. Bureaucracies required a new kind of loyalty, not to bloodlines, but to the state itself. The Ottomans had already built this model with the Janissaries, one of the first professional standing armies in the world since ancient Rome. Europe followed, and in following, it accidentally planted the seed of the modern nation-state. Here's the deeper irony. As states began to rely less on individual nobles and more on common soldiers and taxpayers, power slowly began to shift toward the population. The aristocrat was stepping back. The citizen was, for the first time, stepping forward. Part of the long road toward democracy runs through the smoke of Ottoman cannons. But there's another thread, quieter, less visible, that runs through something far more personal than politics. It runs through the body, and it begins with a disease that once killed 1 in 3 people who caught it. The story of the modern vaccine almost always begins with one man, Edward Jenner. England, 1796. But that story is incomplete. Decades before Jenner's famous experiment, the real breakthrough was already happening in the streets and courtyards of Istanbul. In the early 1700s, Ottoman families were deliberately introducing a small amount of smallpox material into healthy children. Controlled exposure, a calculated risk, teaching the body to fight the disease before the disease could fight back. It was called variolation, and it was the direct ancestor of the modern vaccine. When Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, wife of the British ambassador to Istanbul, witnessed this practice, she was stunned, not because it seemed primitive, because it worked. She didn't look away. She documented it. She advocated for it. She brought it back to England and fought against the ridicule of the European medical establishment that dismissed it as Oriental superstition. Thanks to her persistence, variolation reached England decades before Jenner was born. Lives were saved because someone was willing to take an Eastern practice seriously. But the Ottoman medical revolution didn't stop at the skin. In the Darüşşifa hospitals, particularly in Edirne, another, even more radical idea was being tested. What if the mind could be healed, like the body? While 16th century Europe imprisoned, tortured, or burned the mentally ill as possessed by demons, Ottoman physicians were doing something almost unthinkable for the era. They were treating them. Music therapy, the sound of flowing water, controlled scents, light, space. The Darüşşifa hospitals treated mental illness as a medical condition, not a spiritual failure. These were the earliest prototypes of clinical psychiatry, of holistic medicine, of the idea that the environment a patient inhabits is part of their treatment. Ideas that European textbooks would later celebrate as progressive. Breakthroughs were already being practiced in Ottoman hospital corridors centuries earlier. And as these practices slowly reduced the terror of disease and death, something remarkable happened to everyday life. People began to have time. Time to think, to talk, to debate. And one particular place would become the stage for all of it. Picture this. London, 1688. Two men sit across from each other in a room that smells of roasted coffee and tobacco smoke. One is a ship captain. The other is a merchant. They are negotiating the terms of an insurance policy on a cargo vessel. That conversation in that room would eventually become Lloyd's of London, one of the most powerful financial institutions on earth. And that room was a coffee house. Let's go back to where it started. In 16th century Istanbul, the first coffee houses in history opened their doors. They weren't just places to drink, they were something that had never existed before. A third space. Not home, not work. A place where anyone could sit for the price of a cup and participate in public life. Artisans beside scholars, merchants beside travelers. Ideas that would never have met inside a palace or a workshop, now circulating freely across wooden tables. The coffee house was the world's first low-cost laboratory of public opinion. When Ottoman forces retreated from Vienna in 1683, they left behind something unexpected: sacks of coffee beans. Within years, coffee houses had spread across European cities like wildfire. And here's what changed everything. For centuries, most Europeans drank low-alcohol beer and wine throughout the day because water wasn't safe. The day was, in a sense, blurry. Coffee changed that. Suddenly, the day came into sharp focus. Hours of clear, sober, energized thought became possible for the first time. The rhythm of European intellectual life shifted, and the coffee houses that housed that shift, they became something far more than social clubs. Lloyd's of London, the global insurance empire, began as a coffee house where ship owners and merchants swapped risk over cups of coffee. The London Stock Exchange traces its direct origins to Jonathan's Coffee House, where traders bought and sold shares in what was essentially a semi-formal cafe. And in London's famous penny universities, so called because a single penny bought you entry, anyone could sit, listen, and debate. Philosophers, workers, merchants, all at the same table. The public sphere, democracy, global capitalism, all brewed in an atmosphere pioneered by Ottoman social life. Now pause on that for a moment. The financial systems that govern the global economy today, they were shaped at cafe tables, not in palaces. But there's one more thread, and this one you'll feel rather than understand, because it's been living inside the music you've heard your entire life, hiding in plain sight. Close your eyes and imagine a great symphony. The strings build, the brass soars, and then a crash of cymbals, a thundering bass drum. Where did those sounds come from? They came from a battlefield, and they arrived in Europe's concert halls as the sound of terror. The Mehter, the Ottoman military band, is considered the world's first organized military music corps. Its purpose wasn't entertainment. It was psychological warfare. The deep percussion, the pounding rhythm, the relentless synchronized intensity. It was designed to synchronize an army's march, elevate their courage, and break the enemy's will before a single sword was drawn. When European soldiers and diplomats first encountered Mehter music on the battlefield, many were shaken. The rhythms were unfamiliar, the volume was overwhelming, the effect was visceral. But something unexpected happened. Fear became fascination. European travelers brought the sound home. Composers became obsessed with it. Mozart wrote his Rondo alla Turca. Beethoven wrote his Turkish March. These weren't exotic curiosities. They were serious artistic responses to a serious musical force. And with them came the instruments, cymbals, bass drums, triangles. Before this moment, Western classical music had been dominated by strings and winds. Percussion sat in the corner, occasional, decorative, easy to ignore. Not anymore. The Turkish instruments moved to the center of the orchestra. Percussion became the structural engine of symphonic music, the force that drives tension, releases climax, and physically vibrates the walls of a concert hall. Every time you feel a symphony's peak moment in your chest, every time a cymbal crash raises the hairs on your arms, you are feeling the echo of Mehter. A military band that marched to war in the 15th century is still today reaching through time and shaking the seats of concert halls across the world. Let's zoom out. 5 threads, 5 moments, 5 invisible connections, a trade disruption that drove explorers to cross the Atlantic, a canon that cracked open the age of the modern nation-state, a medical practice that planted the seeds of immunology and psychiatry, a coffeehouse culture that incubated democracy and global finance, a military band whose rhythms still live inside the world's great symphonies. None of this was planned. The Ottoman Empire wasn't trying to shape the West. It was building an empire. It was protecting trade routes. It was fighting wars. It was healing the sick. But the pressure it created, the friction it generated, forced the world to adapt. And adaptation, as history shows us, is the engine of transformation. The currencies we use, the courts that govern us, the vaccines that protect us, the music that moves us, all of them carry traces of an empire that most people know only as a name in a textbook. History is not a gallery of finished paintings. It is a living process, and we are still inside it. The Ottoman Empire did not just exist in history. In many ways, it helped write the code of the present. And that story, it is far from over. This is Ottoman Files. History, with data, with evidence, and without myths. If this video made you see something you'd never noticed before, hit subscribe, because every video we release does exactly the same thing. We take a story you thought you knew and show you what's actually behind it. The next file is already waiting for you.